Undercover boss buys coffee at corner cafe U freezes. When waitress reveals tips could change her life, Michael Foster sat quietly in a corner of Sunrise Corner Cafe, the place where he had once poured his heart into building a warm and welcoming brand known as the friendliest in town. The yellow light from the overhead lamp shone down on the coffee cup in his hand, its steam mingling with the scent of freshly baked toast, bringing back sweet memories of the cafe's early days. In front of him, the familiar ticking of the wall clock echoed like it had every bustling morning when people still called him the father of sunrise. But today, dressed in an old worn jacket with no CEO name tag, Michael was no longer the founder, he was just a stranger. He quietly observed his surroundings, the old wooden tables, neatly arranged, the warm yellow light stretching across the wooden floor. But behind that, he saw hunched figures, hesitant steps, and eyes shadowed with fatigue. A moment later, Lily, a young waitress, approached him with a cup of hot coffee and a plate of steaming toast in hand. She placed them carefully on the table, but her slightly trembling hand caused a drop of water to slide from the rim of the cup onto the plate, mixing with the sweet aroma that Michael had always loved. Lily's hair was slightly disheveled, her face pale, and her eyes ringed with fatigue from lack of sleep. In that moment, Michael felt like he was looking at the faces of the staff he had once promised to protect. With a trembling voice, Lily hesitated. "If the tips here were shared fairly, I could afford a proper meal every day, sir." Her words cut straight into Michael's heart like a knife. Every word that fell from her lips felt like tears that had yet to dry on someone's cheek, each one piercing deeply into him, laying bare a truth he had never expected. Sunrise Corner Cafe, once the pride and second home for young people like Lily, was now pushing them to the edge of despair because of tips that were being stolen. Amid the warmth of the coffee's steam, Michael could hear the pounding of his own heart, the heart of a founder betrayed by the very values he had worked so hard to build. A tear rolled down Lily's cheek, falling onto the tray of toast. Like a cold blade, it stabbed into Michael's memory back in the day. He had stood at this very corner of the counter, personally dividing every tip among the staff, each bright, happy eye like a star in the night. Now his dream of a fair Sunrise Cafe was shattered, and Lily had become the unintentional mirror reflecting that pain. Michael was stunned to realize that staff tips were being unfairly distributed, most ending up in the pockets of a favored few, while those working the hardest, like Lily, struggled just to get by. Just one small change, a transparent fair tip policy, could help them afford a full meal and a peaceful night's sleep. In that moment, Michael Foster knew he could no longer sit silently. Michael Foster sat quietly in the corner of Sunrise Corner Cafe, a small, cozy branch tucked into a busy street corner. The early morning air still held a hint of dew outside the window, the gentle yellow light illuminating the dark wooden tables, bringing back memories of when he had stood behind the toast counter, carefully dividing each tip among the staff. To everyone, Michael was more than just a CEO. He was a founder who had poured his whole heart into every cup of coffee, every crunchy piece of toast. Lately, Sunrise Corner Cafe had unexpectedly become the center of rumors about injustice tips being unfairly distributed, staff complaints about favoritism, and more young faces behind the pastry counter wearing weary, downcast eyes. Michael heard each of these complaints and felt his heart tighten. Sunrise Cafe, the place he had always proudly called the second home for all employees, was now surrounded by accusations, suspicious looks, and the slumped shoulders of exhausted workers during their shifts. Michael looked around the cafe. The familiar POS machine still stood there like a silent guardian of every transaction and every tip. He remembered the days when the staff's eyes sparkled with trust in the transparency he had promised. But recent reports showed declining revenue, customer complaints about service, and an unprecedented number of resignations. It all felt like a crack in the trust he had spent years building. So today, Michael, founder of Sunrise Cafe, 50 years old, hair streaked with silver, and eyes that had once shone with conviction, wore a simple gray jacket, an old baseball cap, and a black scarf to hide his familiar face. He walked into the cafe like a stranger, his eyes drifting over each table, each warm yellow light, and every soft laugh. He was no longer the CEO of Sunrise Cafe, but just a man trying to see deeper into the corners of the place that had once been called a second home. He decided only by witnessing it firsthand, by hearing with his own ears what was happening, could he truly understand why Sunrise Corner Cafe, his own brainchild, was on the verge of collapse. And he knew just a single glance or a single sentence from a staff member would be enough to reveal whether the dream of fairness he had built still existed or had been betrayed by the very people he had once trusted. In the warm yellow light, the steaming cup of coffee in his hand trembled slightly with Michael's breath. He knew his own investigation had begun. And no matter how harsh the truth might be, he was ready to face it to save Sunrise Cafe, to win back the trust of the young people who had once believed in him, and to make the place a true home once again. Michael sat silently in the corner of the cafe, the yellow light shining down on the polished wooden table, illuminating every scratch like the scars in his own heart when he heard about the injustices happening at Sunrise Corner Cafe. The faint scent of coffee floated around his nose, reminding him of the mornings long ago when he had personally sprinkled sugar on every slice of toast and divided every tip with trembling hands but eyes full of hope. But today that hope seemed shattered. He saw Lily, a young girl still wearing the slightly worn apron, her hair neatly tied behind her neck, her eyes shadowed by the long shifts. She lowered her head as she approached his table gently, placing the steaming cup of coffee, as if she were afraid of breaking the already fragile atmosphere. Her eyes briefly glanced up, hesitant but carrying an unspoken pain. Her lips trembled, then relaxed, her voice trembling like the first gust of winter wind. "If tips here were shared fairly, I could afford a full meal every day." Michael was stunned. Each word felt like a knife cutting across his heart. Lily's eyes briefly dimmed, then lit up again with a faint glimmer of hope. A hope that the man across from her might understand the pain she had kept hidden for so long. Michael remembered the old days when he had promised every staff member, "At Sunrise Cafe, fairness is not just in the numbers, but in how we treat each other." But today, right in the place he once called his second home, the very tips, the sweat of people like Lily had become just another number manipulated during low-traffic shifts with managers looking away. Lily's words were like a wake-up call, reminding him why he built Sunrise Cafe in the first place, so that everyone could smile after every shift, and no one would have to endure hunger just because tips weren't fairly distributed. Just then, a janitor passed by holding a dripping mop, his eyes sad, his voice low, like a bitter message carried into the warm air, filled with the smell of toast and coffee. "Here, the ones who work the hardest are the ones who suffer the most." Michael gripped his coffee cup, his fingers trembling. That sentence was like a second knife cutting deeper into his heart. Sunrise Cafe, the place he had built with all his heart, was now being betrayed by the very people he once trusted. His breath caught, and his eyes glistened with a mix of pain and anger. He knew this was the turning point. He was no longer a stranger sitting silently in a corner. He was Michael Foster, founder of Sunrise Cafe, the man who had pledged fairness in every tip, the one who had once proudly called this place a second home. And now no one else had to stand up and fight for the dream of fairness for people like Lily. In the faint morning light, Michael knew it was time to face the truth, to save Sunrise Corner Cafe, to reclaim the trust that had once been built with the sweat and tears of dedicated people. Michael sat quietly in the corner, the yellow light shining on his hair, now flecked with gray, his eyes heavy with unspoken thoughts. The smell of coffee mingled with the whispers of casual conversations, but in his mind, there was only a cold, dark void, a darkness he knew he had to face to bring back the light of justice for Sunrise Corner Cafe. Every observation brought a painful realization. A group of young employees, crisp uniforms, walked confidently through the cafe, their faces aglow with a confidence that belonged only to those who had been chosen. They were always assigned the busiest shifts, bustling with customers, tips flowing like water with every order. The yellow light highlighted their triumphant smiles, the smiles of those who already knew the rewards had been decided long ago. Michael saw their knowing glances, silent nods, signals that only those inside the circle of privilege could read. Meanwhile, in another corner, Lily, the young girl, whose words about a daily meal had left Michael speechless, continued to work quietly. The yellow light fell on her uniform, highlighting the long sweat marks on the frayed collar. Her eyes were tired, her hands trembled as she gathered plates of toast, cleaned the counter, and cleared each coffee cup. Every movement carried a sadness that hadn't yet found its voice. Michael noticed that she was always assigned the shifts with the fewest customers, where tips were so scarce they wouldn't even cover a decent breakfast. Her eyes glistened with a sense of isolation, as if searching for an escape from the invisible walls of injustice. Michael's eyes met the POS counter, where the cold blue glow from the computer screen lit up the face of a young employee, his expression as cold as frost. He stood there, his hands flying across the keyboard like a skilled musician. His fingers moved deftly, but Michael could see each tip amount appear and then vanish from the screen, as if the blue light itself was devouring the sweat and tears of employees like Lily. Every beep that sounded felt like a cold blade shredding the trust he had worked so hard to build. A sharp pain clenched in Michael's chest, the pain of a founder who had once believed that fairness couldn't just exist on paper, but had to be present in every cup of coffee poured with human kindness. He remembered the old days when he himself had divided every dollar of tips for the staff, when their eyes sparkled like stars' eyes that believed their sweat would be rewarded with fairness and trust. Now Michael knew that Lily had tried to do the right thing. That young woman had quietly recorded every stolen tip, every unfair shift schedule, every threatening message sent to weaker staff members. But her handwriting was shaky, as if her own hand was too afraid to hold tight to that flame of justice. Michael could imagine her trembling as she hid those papers among the trays of toast, glancing around the cafe like a thief stealing light, afraid that a cold stare might strip away the last place she could stand to keep going. Michael's grip tightened, his knuckles white on the coffee cup handle. Every breath he took seemed to blend with the sighs of the young people who had believed this place was a second home. Inside him, he heard his own voice, raspy but strong like forged steel. Did I let this happen? The yellow light shone on his face, revealing every crow's footlines etched by years of sacrifice, of sleepless nights, thinking about a fair and human Sunrise Corner Cafe. Michael understood this wasn't just a fight against a crooked POS system, but a fight to reclaim the trust he had once poured his heart into building. He lifted his eyes to Lily. In her eyes, a tear shone that hadn't yet fallen. In that look, Michael saw all the dreams that had been nurtured that he himself had helped spark to life. And he knew just one small change, one right decision, could revive that trust, could bring Sunrise Corner Cafe back to being the second home he'd once envisioned. Michael was ready. Michael's throat tightened as he followed Lily's every step, that small figure now standing as the symbol of those left behind in this game of tips. The yellow light overhead fell on her sweat-stained uniform, highlighting the splotches that looked like unhealed scars. Michael knew each stain was a drop of sweat, a dream exchange for grueling shifts and long nights that barely bought Lily a simple breakfast. Michael leaned slightly, his hand resting on the armrest, as if he wanted to stand up and act immediately, but his legs felt frozen. He wondered, was it he, the one who had once promised to build a home for everyone who had let everything slip through his fingers? Had he been too focused on revenue numbers and forgotten the bright eyes of those young people who once exclaimed, "Thank you, boss, I got my fair share of tips"? Michael shuddered. A group of young employees still moved lightly through the cafe, their fingers gently brushing their aprons as if they were wearing an invisible medal. Their eyes still carried a smug look, as if they were sure the rewards would come to them no matter how hard anyone else worked. They laughed and exchanged glances of mutual understanding, the kind of look that made Michael want to shout, "This is Sunrise Corner Cafe, not a casino." He turned to the POS system, the cold blue light from the screen shining on the face of a young employee. The young man continued working intently, his fingers dancing like a skilled performer, his eyes cold and unfeeling. Each beep sounded like a knife, severing the bonds of trust Michael had once tied with his own hands. He couldn't help but wonder, had he helped to create a system that could devour the sweat and tears of people like Lily? Michael closed his eyes and remembered the old days, when he wore an old apron, carefully counting out each dollar of tips to distribute to each person. Their eyes then had sparkled like stars in the night sky, the eyes of people who believed that if they just worked hard, they would be rewarded fairly. Those eyes, the eyes of trust, where had they gone now? Buried under the cold blue light of the POS, under unnamed privileges, under threatening messages hidden in a manager's phone. Michael opened his eyes, his hands clenched into fists. He saw Lily bow her head, her hair falling like a curtain to hide the tears that were about to fall. Michael wondered how many tears had fallen on the trays of toast, had soaked into that old apron, had seeped into the wooden floors of the Sunrise Corner Cafe that he once called a second home. He looked around each young employee's face, passing like a slow-motion film the bright eyes of the past, now replaced with looks of worry and fear. How many of them were silently enduring because they were afraid of retaliation? How many had shed tears over tips stolen right before their eyes? Michael took a deep breath, as if to gather all the pain, the anger, and the love into one breath. He knew if he didn't stand up now, Sunrise Corner Cafe would never again be a second home. It would become nothing but an empty shell of trust, a supposed safe haven, stolen by the unscrupulous. He silently vowed, "No one, not even I, can stay silent for another day." A hot bead of sweat ran down his temple, mingling with the golden light, like the tears of all the other Lilies who had once trusted this place as their home. Michael stood tall, his shoulders tense like a shield of faith. He knew what lay ahead would be a confrontation, the gaze of those who had once called him their founder, the place where everything would change if he dared to step into the light. Because he understood, just one right decision, just one click on the POS, just one clear declaration would be enough to rekindle the fading flame of trust. And he was ready. Under the warm but heavy yellow light, Michael stood up, the wooden chair under him creaking like a wake-up call, echoing throughout the cafe. The yellow light shone straight down on his face, revealing every wrinkle of the years of dedication, the face of a founder who had once poured his entire heart into building Sunrise Corner Cafe, making it a second home for so many people. His eyes shone with a resolute look, the eyes of a father standing among his spiritual children, protecting them with all his trust and love. He held up a stack of printed evidence high, his hand trembling slightly but firm, each finger gripping tightly, as if to keep justice from slipping away amidst the swirl of injustice. The yellow light illuminated each page, tips, manipulated unfair shift schedules, threatening messages to employees, all revealed like knives carving deep into his heart. His voice rang out deep and powerful, each word as heavy as a hammer striking the wall of deceit that had cloaked the cafe for so long. This is your sweat and tears stolen by these managers. From today onward, every tip will be given to the one who deserves it. The cafe fell silent, the atmosphere frozen in that moment. The POS beeped, the sound that had once been Michael's pride and transparency now rang out like a damning confession. The blue light from the POS screen shone on the manager's face, revealing every bead of sweat streaming down his temple, the sweat of shame from someone whose true face had just been exposed. His shoulders trembled violently, his eyes lowered, avoiding the gaze of the very founder who had once trusted him with upholding fairness. Michael turned his gaze toward Lily, the young woman whose eyes had once sparkled with trust, now brimming with tears. But they were no longer tears of fear and helplessness, but tears of trust, finally called by its rightful name, justice. The yellow light shone on her face, making her eyes glow like a lamp, illuminating hope for all those who had silently shed tears in the darkness. Michael felt his heart pound, as if beating in time with the breaths of the people around him. In that moment, he knew that Sunrise Corner Cafe had truly come back to life, not just with words, but with his own heart, with the very sweat of all those who had once called this place a second home. Because today, that yellow light had not only illuminated the cafe, but it also rekindled the trust he had once built with his entire heart. Michael stood still, his heart beating like a battle drum, each beat rising in his chest, the beat of truth, of compassion, and of hope, reborn after so many layered injustices. His eyes swept across the cafe like a father, seeking the eyes of each of his children, his spiritual children, the employees who had once helped him turn this place into a second home. A murmur began to spread throughout the cafe, the employees standing silently behind the pastry counter, the servers holding trays of fresh bread, the eyes that had once bowed in fear now looked up following his every move. Some had red eyes, some had hands trembling, all of them silent, as if in that moment only Michael's voice could save them. Michael took a deep breath, then his voice rang out once more, warm yet firm. I once promised that this place would not just be a cafe, but would be your second home. A place where fairness is a given, where every drop of sweat is repaid with gratitude and deservedly. His hand gripped the stack of evidence, his fingers trembling slightly but resolute. Each page seemed soaked in the sweat and tears of those who had believed that fairness existed. He raised the papers high, his voice louder than ever. Those who have twisted this trust will pay the price. They have not only betrayed me, but they have betrayed everyone who once called this place family. The yellow light shone down, illuminating the sweat on Michael's temple, the sweat of a CEO who had spent countless sleepless nights trying to uphold his promise of fairness for his employees. In the eyes of everyone, he was no longer just a CEO behind a desk, but a father, a colleague, a guiding light. Suddenly, a young server, his face pale and his eyes filled with relief, after so many days of living in fear, stepped forward. His voice choked, "Mr. Foster, we've been afraid for too long. But today, because of you, we dare to lift our heads and face the truth." That voice, trembling yet determined, echoed like a wake-up call, making the cafe space glow. Michael stepped forward, his hand gently resting on the boy's shoulder, his eyes shining with hope. From today, everything will change. Every tip, every hour of work will be given rightfully to those who deserve it, and you will no longer have to bow your heads. Beside the toast counter, Lily stood tall, her eyes brimming with tears, but also shining with resilient light. In her eyes, Michael saw trust that had once been extinguished but now was rekindled. The yellow light shone on her face, turning her into a symbol of hope, of the rebirth of Sunrise Corner Cafe. Michael's voice rang out, no longer just the voice of a CEO, but the voice of a founder, a father, a man who had given his whole heart to preserve fairness. Sunrise Corner Cafe will never forget the tears that have been shed here. We will make this place a second home for all of you, where everyone can hold their heads high and be proud of what they have accomplished. Then in the radiant yellow light, the soft jazz music played, and the sounds of laughter began to return. Sunrise Corner Cafe, the second home, had truly come back to life. Michael knew tomorrow's sunrise would be different, not just for Lily, but for all those who had once trusted him, because fairness had now been called by its rightful name. That morning, Morning Glow Cafe was filled with yellow light, the light of trust reborn in every breath. Lily, the young woman who had once uttered the words that broke Michael's heart, now wore the shift manager's shirt. Her eyes shone with confidence and pride, her radiant smile full of hope. She had become the symbol of the resilience and fairness that Sunrise Corner Cafe had once promised, and she was now passing that flame on to all the other young people. Around her, the young employees no longer wore lost looks, no longer walked with heavy steps. Now they could afford rent and buy a decent meal after each shift. Their eyes sparkled with the light of people who knew that their efforts would be rewarded fairly, that every tip was deserved, not a gift from those who knew how to curry favor. Michael stood quietly in a corner of the cafe, the yellow light shining on his face, the face of a founder who had once poured his heart into building this place. He thought back to those early days, when he handed out every tip, when he personally arranged every table, when his employees' eyes shone with hope every day. And now, one small change, just one transparent policy, one simple explanation for customers about the importance of tips was enough to save it all. Just one click on the POS system, one brief meeting to adjust the tip-sharing policy that was enough to change the entire system he had once believed in. Just one right decision could revive the dream of fairness he had once promised. And now that dream had been reborn, not just in words, but in the eyes and hearts of everyone who had once called this place their second home. Michael stood there silently watching Lily guide the new employees, a bright smile on her face, the smile of someone who had overcome every fear to stand up for fairness. In her eyes, Michael saw a single tear glistening, but it was no longer a tear of injustice. It was a tear of hope that had finally been named. Michael thought to himself, one tear changed an entire system. And then like a slow-motion film, the yellow light shone on the eyes of those around him, eyes that reflected the revival of trust. Michael knew that Sunrise Corner Cafe had been saved not just by documents, but by the very heart and love he had once nurtured. How many more waitresses live on tips they never get? A question like a knife cutting straight to the listener's heart, inviting them to comment and share so that everyone would wake up and join hands to change. Fairness cannot be measured by the dry numbers in a revenue report. It lives in the eyes, in the sweat, and in the tears of those who help turn a cafe into a second home. It exists in the way you listen, value, and protect the people who helped you build this dream from the very first brick. Because after all, fairness is the heart of a business, the breath that nurtures hope, the flame that keeps that home warm, and it can only exist if it is nurtured by humanity.